analysis, new product development, and sustainability. The workshop's first goal was addressing the unmet public health and safety needs within the medical cannabis community. His detailed investigations into the chemistry of cannabis, including 5 peer-reviewed publications to date, including some of the ones that Rosanna mentioned during her talk, provides him with a unique perspective and knowledge base in assisting state and local regulators in the construction and implementation of effective regulatory solutions for safe and sustainable delivery of medical cannabis. His technical insights and understanding of the complex regulatory scope continues to prove very helpful in assisting many entrepreneurs with their efforts within the cannabis arena. Dr. Raber holds a PhD in chemistry from the University of Southern California, but we still love him here at UCLA anyway.
I can still get invited even though I went to that other school. And I probably should say, instead of medical, maybe physiological cannabis, because we'll talk about adult use as well, but I think all cannabis is impacting physiological response. So probably more of a tax regulation or a definition between medical and adult use, but I believe it's impacting the body system, and that's probably how we should fundamentally look at it and determine some of the great questions that we've heard today. So cannabis is complex in many, many different ways, not only from a regulatory and legal perspective, but certainly from a chemical composition perspective. And you've heard some of that in terms of how does that impact when we go and look for DUI limits, and how are people impacted physiologically by what they're consuming. So this is what I believe is the most current numbers based on what we found in and on cannabis. So I say both because the plant has unique machinery to make some molecules. They degrade with heat and light. They degrade in other ways via oxidation. There can be microorganisms on there that convert them to other things. So you find it on cannabis, but cannabis doesn't always have the machinery to make that direct molecule. There are now 144 different known cannabinoids. Predominantly we talk about 2 to 3, which is kind of interesting. Terpenes and terpenoids are certainly rising in popularity, and I think in the not too distant future we'll talk about flavonoids as well. And there's a wide array of effects from all of those, and a combination of those. So what is most common, what do we see out in the marketplace today? And as Jeff mentioned, we've been surveying through the analytical laboratory perspective since 2010. So we have a pretty broad-based understanding of the molecules in these different types of products, and there's a large litany of products. If you can imagine the product someone's tried to shove cannabis in there, isn't always a good product in the marketplace, but that certainly exists that way. What we first and foremost see is THC. You see some CBD as well. We're starting to see some of the cannabinoid acids, but it's predominantly still THC and CBD. So there are others that are being reported. Different states require reporting of certain ones as well. I hear a lot of mention of CBN today. For what reason, I have no idea. So most people wrongfully believe that it causes sedation. I don't know where this comes from other than old cannabis trying to be sold. The old literature says it really causes hypothermia and muscle loss, or control of muscle loss, muscle function. So yeah, loss of muscle function, sorry. And it's really, that doesn't seem like favorable effects to me. So there have been old products that have degraded almost literally to completely CBN, and some brave souls have consumed them and said they felt next to no physiological response. Not a desirable one anyway, and they certainly did not pass out and fall asleep. So I think you cannot, can't stress this enough. What you hear or see on the internet or in the community is not well known, and it's not very well understood. So someone may say something, someone might market something, but next to none of that is backed by solid formal clinical studies or by well-defined controlled compositional studies. So as exciting as it is that we can see many things from cannabis, I think the challenge of that is all of those things are probably happening, and we don't know when happens to whom, basically. So we're still very much just scratching the surface of this giant iceberg in terms of how do we get the specific compositions to cause specific and desired physiological responses. And it's not just one cannabinoid, it's not just one other molecule with it. Even if we have labels that contain 5 or 10 compounds, it's still probably not going to be enough to know what cannabis composition causes which physiological function. I'm starting to use more and more the term that Dr. Lester Grinspoon coined, the ensemble effect, because the entourage effect says that one guy is important and everybody else kind of goes along with them. But I think all of them are important. So it's really all of what's there, how many are there, in which ratios, and not one being more important than the other. And we can probably say cannabinoids are a major driver, but terpenes and other components, or certainly other minor cannabinoids that labs are not even reporting, can have huge physiological impacts as well. So saying ensemble effect means the whole group is having some sort of effect and some sort of importance on the physiological function. And I'd like to see that term kind of rise in popularity if we could all start thinking that way. This is one of my favorite slides because THC is not on there. And you can see all of these wonderful physiological impacts that could be made through cannabis or cannabinoids and other types of uses. And it really is an indicator of how much more we have to discover and in which ways might all of these things impact the body. Most of the studies are from single molecule studies. So we have to take those with a grain of salt because they're not a whole cannabis composition. Recent work out of Israel by Ruth Galili says single molecule CBD has a very narrow therapeutic window where whole plant extracts with CBD had a much more broad utility. And very different physiological functions. So I think everyone in the research community is starting to awaken that I need to look at more of these types of compositions in a broader based fashion. Fortunately, analytical equipment is coming online to make it easier to look at more and more things, even at the smaller amounts. And that should hopefully change with regulations as well. As labs are required, you'll get people to invest in them, hopefully, because it is very high capital cost to run them. And we can start to learn more about the compositions that are there. And I think you've heard this today in a number of ways, but it's not just one molecule. If one molecule was very effective, Marinol would be wildly effective, and we probably wouldn't be here today talking about cannabis in the whole plant composition. But many patients say that doesn't work for them, doesn't provide the desired physiological response, yet whole plant cannabis or derivatives of that seem to have a much better effect. So again, it's really that ensemble effect and the entire composition. And we've heard the word today, synergy. 1 + 1 is actually greater than 2. There are other things that go on when you add these things in combination. You're probably most well familiar with alcohol plus cannabis doesn't equal either one of them by themselves. And certainly within cannabis, the components within that composition do some of that as well. So from a chemical standpoint, I think it is important. The word cannabinoid is a broad-based term. It could also mean synthetic cannabinoids like spice, K2, and other components that are completely not found in the plant. So phytocannabinoid is a more specific term to say these components are found in the plant. Up here are the 4 major cannabinoid acids that the plant produces. And then they can be processed or degraded over time with the heat, and that will form the neutral cannabinoids that are shown here. And that goes through a process called decarboxylation. The plant's machinery has been pretty well understood. It's actually been taken out and put in tobacco root, and some people are now using it to be expressed in yeast or other enzymes. Enzymatic pathways have been taken out, and what we know is it stops at the cannabinoid acid. So there is no machinery in the cannabis plant to make THC or CBD. It's THC acid. So my dream of making THC-laden watermelon fell apart when I learned that. It's really a little disappointing, but it's important to understand that that's what we see in the analytical lab. That's actually what's being held. And most likely from an evolutionary standpoint, what was the deer or other animals consuming when they nibbled on the leaf or the flower? Predominantly large amounts of cannabinoid acids and trace amounts of the neutral cannabinoids. We now know that it's multimodal. You can have a lot of different effects from different dosing regimes of THC or CBD. And maybe less is more. And other work out of Israel with Yosef Sarni has shown that ultra-low doses of THC can actually improve cognitive abilities and improve neuroprotection. So at large amounts, you get very different effects than you do at very, very small amounts. And it's possible we were all getting very small amounts, or other biological systems were getting small amounts of neutral cannabinoids. And that, I'm talking fractions of a milligram for someone of an adult's body weight. This is the process of decarboxylation that is depicted. Most people ask, how long does it take to decarboxylate the cannabinoid acid to the neutral one? And my smart-ass answer is it can take a lifetime if you leave it at room temperature. So it's related to temperature. How hot do I get it relates to how fast I can do that. But if I heat it up too hot, the THC will volatilize and leave. So I've got a limit to how hot I might be able to heat it and affect that transformation. THC does decarboxylate faster than CBD as well. So, and CBG is different as well. So each of those molecules has their own rate, and you can see some really crazy results depending upon how it's actually done, especially if it's done in the kitchen. But close, tightly controlled analytical processes are very important to watching your manufacturing efforts and making sure that you've either fully decarboxylated or know what your ratios are so you can put together the right composition every single time. I really like to think of, you've heard about other diversity today, certainly within our populations, and how there might be others who get licenses, but the plant and the product diversity that we have through cannabis is really, really, really broad-based. So up here is a list of the different types of products that you might see, from different plant materials to different concentrates, sublingual types of products, there's topical products as well, and oral products. So all of those can be delivering different chemical compositions. They can be used for different reasons. They can have different dosing regimes for different people. And the world of complexity in this fashion just keeps getting broader and broader. So it makes it a little bit of a challenge from a regulatory standpoint. How do I really try to regulate this broad-based class of products that might be offered to the marketplace? It makes it really interesting from a scientific standpoint. What am I studying for whom? But it becomes a huge challenge. Well, how do I match up the right composition for the right patient? And I think we're going to need a new nomenclature system to really start to understand how we're going to have a very concerted conversation between doctors, patients, and across our whole community. And it will be a community-based effort to solving that problem. It won't be some person solved it. We're all going to have to get on the same page to make sure we're talking about the same things together. So plant material is one product, and that's where it all starts. And how you cultivate it, how you dry it, how it's cured, trimmed, and actually brought to market in the package can be very, very different. So the exact same clones from tissue culture could really provide different end results in terms of chemical composition if they are cultivated in different conditions. So indoor versus outdoor is a broad-based one. Different nutrient cycles, different humidity conditions. The plant is generating these molecules to talk to its environment and other plants around it, not necessarily only for us. And therefore, if I have different things impacting it while it's being cultivated, it might express different chemical expression. So if I know the genetics, I know what my chemical opportunity is. What I can actually get at the end is dictated through its environmental conditions. So it's one thing to say I know I'm starting with these genes, but it's another to say that I know they were all turned on, when they were turned on, to which extent, and which end product am I holding in my hand. Take that a step further and I get to an infused product where I take the plant material and I'm now doing other steps in a process that will change its chemical composition even further. From extraction to refining those things, decarboxylation rates, and what the actual formulation methodologies are. All of those can impact what the chemical composition is. So what we often hear is, I did a whole plant extraction. Well, I threw the whole plant in the extractor, but I got only a tiny fraction of it out in my extract. Because I lost a lot of terpenes, I've winterized it, which means I've added ethanol and evaporated it, which means I've evaporated most all of the terpenes that came with it. You hear people say I've trapped some terpenes. Which ones? Did they change from what was on the plant? How are they different? How do you know that's consistent from batch to batch? And I can say for sure, today we have very, very little product standardization and consistent compositions that are being brought under a product name. So it's very difficult to offer to a patient something that's going to reliably and consistently give them the same physiological response every single time. But if that's not enough complexity, how we consume that is another layer of complexity, making it very different again in how it impacts the body. So different types of inhalation methods, whether I'm going sublingual or oral, is whether I'm going to go through the liver first and foremost, and I have some other slides on that. And topically, is there anything else in that formulation that helps it impact its ability to go through the dermis or the epidermis and actually get in through the skin? So I think, someone's like, I put CBD in this cream. Where is it? Is it laying on top of your body? Is it still there? Does that have an impact from receptor signaling? Some of those things we don't know. And topical understandings are going to be a big challenge because understanding the blood levels of that it's going to be so minute that you might not even be able to find good analytical hardware to test for that accurately. But it also points to a very, very small amount. Seems to be effective again, because we are seeing people say, I don't know what's in here or how well it works, but it works really well for me. So I don't know how much it takes to work, but I feel pain relief topically when I use this type of product. And I think that that's rather interesting, because you can, how much you need to use relates to cost and how cost effective that could be for certain types of products. And certainly at much lower doses, you don't have to worry about intoxication. And could eliminate some of the problems that we see in that regard. How you get to those products is exceptionally important. As I alluded to, making the extracts or the concentrates and the whole process of going through that is really what can vary your composition. So even if we start with the exact same plants, but we take it through 4 different extraction methodologies, whether I use bubble hash process, if I use hydrocarbons or butane to extract it, alcohol, isopropanol types of extraction, or CO2 methods. Each one of those compositions are different, even though I started from the same plant product. If I go further and winterize or distill and make the product different again, I have another opportunity of complexity in changing that composition, or ways I'm going to lose things that I might want. So any of those could be effective, and they could be great for a large number of patients. But if you are bringing a product to market, you have to standardize your methodology and make sure that you do it consistently every single time, so that you say my plants were the same, my process was the same, therefore my product is the same. So that's when you hear people saying I've got FDA botanical drugs that have gone through. Even if I know like 2 out of the 100 components that may be in there, if I can prove that all of them are the same, they're all giving the same response on my chromatograms on my HPLC, I don't have to identify every single one of them, but I can say this is quote unquote the same, and then will elicit the same physiological response when used the same way. And I still see a great lack of standardization in that respects, unfortunately. And I think licensing will allow people to invest in infrastructure. GMP protocols in California are going to require that you document and do things the same. And we'll start to see the rise of standardized products here, hopefully very soon. That's the concentrate. We have another step, which would be the formulation. What am I putting it into? So if I'm going to put it into water, I'm going to use an emulsifier. That's going to change the absorption rates, and that will change perhaps how it's absorbed in my body. Are these products, when they're produced, are they uniform? So chocolate's probably pretty good as being uniform across the entire batch of chocolate, but a chocolate-dipped strawberry is probably not going to have the same amount of chocolate on the strawberry every single time. So that type of product is not going to be uniform. It's not going to have good homogeneity, and most likely won't make it through the new regulatory system. So things like Cheetos or spraying stuff on top of other products will not be allowed, and it will not make it through in California's new regulatory schemes, which I think is good, because it should be standardized. It has to be consistent, and whether you're using it in adult use, you want to know you got 5 milligrams and didn't have the wrong corner of the brownie pan giving you 50. And those types of things we have seen consistently from the laboratory perspective. So on the label it said 50 grams was the brownie weight, yet we weighed it and it weighed 75. So you already, even if your milligram per gram concentration across the brownie was the same, you didn't have what you thought you had in there. You didn't have 10 milligrams, you had 15. So those types of things are interesting from a product creation standpoint. You're going to see certain types of products will be much more amenable to getting through the regulatory scheme than others. And really, I think we're still looking at only the tip of that iceberg with THC and CBD concentrations. How do you know those are right? And some of the draft regulations didn't even have the wording right. Watching that perfectly. Hopefully they will fix that. But that's kind of excluding terpene compositions and other things that we know can wildly impact the cannabinoids as well. The plants are wildly diverse in their own right? So we've all heard the colorful names, and there are probably thousands of cultivars that are out there. And then there are phenotypic expressions, different expressions from different ways to cultivate them. What is really in a quote-unquote strain name? And that was a problem that we saw early on that kind of plagued us. And you can't say to a patient, go take Blue Dream, and they go down the street and it's a different Blue Dream. Especially those wildly popularized names or ones that have won Cannabis Cup awards, they are the ones most subject and likely to abuse, or to be subject to abuse. And it's really unfair to a patient that's told, go get that strain name, and no one knows what that name represents from a chemical composition standpoint. And I would say today, we still don't have really good ideas about that. We might have clues. It's going to be very hard to go backwards and say we actually know what sour diesel is or what one of the popular names might be. Going forward, if a breeder has said, I created this, I'm going to call it this name, I'm licensed, I can cultivate it every single time, and the lab can watch that from a broad-based chemical perspective, then we have a chance of saying, we know that someone has this within these certain types of standard protocols. Patients can start to rely on those. What we started to do back in 2011 was look at the terpene profile. So it was obvious at the end of 2010 that we saw a lot of different cultivars come through, so a lot of cannabinoid profiles, and they all look the same. So you could just overlay them on top of themselves. You could see 3 different cultivars that were 15% THC, for example, yet they look different, they smell different, and they had wildly different physiological effects for people. What else was going on was what was of interest to us then, and that was terpenes. So we started to do this type of profiling back in 2011. And really saw the world of variability from that perspective. And this is just a small example of some of what we might see. What I'll cover next is we hand-selected 2,200 different flower samples from dispensaries. My brother and I drove around Southern California for a large number of miles and a lot of time. But we knew what we were getting. We got it identified by the dispensary, which was typically told from the cultivator or changed by the dispensary. So it was what the consumer would be getting. So this is from kind of the patient perspective. And we made sure that we picked that right from the 1-pound bag, for example. So it wasn't just a single sample, it was a very diverse and large number of small pieces that made up each of those samples to be represented. Our average THC number was 16% across that, right? Not these 25, 30, 40% numbers that you see out of Washington. Those are not representative of an entire batch. And what we find is terpenes are the major variability parts. Like most of the THC numbers were consistent, and there was next to no CBD in the database because there was very little of that there. This one's of interest to a lot of people because you hear sativa indica hybrid as 3 major designations of what could possibly be physiological effects, right? Sativa being uplifting energetics, indicas being downregulating sedative, and hybrid somewhere in between. In a perfect world, we'd see 3 circles, all the sativas, all the hybrids, kind of in the middle, and indicas by themselves. What we've noticed is it's nowhere like that, right? So they're all smeared on top of themselves. There really is no chemical designation that could be set from the morphological designation of sativa, indica, and hybrid. So those are really indicators of plant growth cycle, how long it will take the plant to be cultivated, what type of plant I might have, short, bushy, tall, long, stretched, and how long it will take to get there.
What are these axes?
So this is a principal component axis. So the methodology for this is called principal component analysis. You're trying to take a slice through a 3-dimensional picture. This is just one 2-dimensional representation of that. So your weighting components that we've actually used in the analysis, it was around 35 different components that we looked at. Mathematically, it tries to weight each of them to pull the data apart as much as possible. And we're continuing to analyze this data with some additional help by statisticians and other ways to try and look at it. And 3-dimensionally looks a little bit differently too. What we see here is a little bit with where, let's just shrink down the number, try and look at where the names were more popularized. Do we see some grouping in that respect? And you see a little bit, Harlequin's over there on the bottom left in the light green. That was really tightly clustered because there was not a lot of abuse of that, and it's a higher CBD cultivar. So it's much more unlikely to be misnamed into something else. Jack Hare, Trainwreck, those guys have very, very distinct chemical profiles, high in terpinolene, and that's what drives them up and to the left on that side, and the ones pulling to the right are higher in limonene and linalool. And what this plot shows is this is what they call the loading plot. So based on this, where are the terpenes that are pulling them apart in that fashion? And the one interesting thing is THC is almost right in the middle of the loading plot. And that says that has next to no influence on the variability in there. So it's really a lot about the terpenes and not about that one major cannabinoid that you see there. So just trying to shrink it down again and make it a little bit more simple and seeing what types of possible abuse do you see from a name. OG Kush, like everyone calls, whatever they need to sell, basically that one. We have seen the misnaming while we were sampling at the dispensaries, and that was disheartening, not only to the poor cultivator that thought they were going to bring a new brand to market, but to the patient perspective saying, I'm trying to get something that I can really benefit from. How do I know what it is?
Does this suggest that we might, as consumers and also as people looking at the space, be better off thinking about these like style of wine almost, where a Cabernet is going to have a certain flavor profile, it's going to be in a certain area of red wine that you don't, but it doesn't really tell you.
But you don't really know what type of Cabernet you have. Yeah. Now, I think in some respects you can trust your nose, right? If it's higher in certain terpenes, you can say, whatever they called it, I'll start to identify it myself. I have a very sensitive detector right here. And some people are really good, especially the purchasing agents at dispensaries. They have seen so much stuff, they're like, no, you can't call it that. It's not even close to that. But some are just like, I don't care, call it what you need to, we need to sell that stuff. That will change in a regulated system, right? The labels will show up to the dispensary, so you won't have that guy changing it. If someone has bred some sort of cultivar that they want to be proud of, or that's going to have specific physiological effects, they don't want anybody changing that, and they'll start to create value in their brand names. So I think we'll see this problem start to disappear a little bit, but everyone's still calling a lot of the old school stuff whatever name they think they can, because it still retains a high value in the marketplace. Better analytical, though, is moving in the direction of saying, let's start to try and clarify what this is. If you're going to call it that, let's start to say as a community, it's got to look mostly like this, and start to draw some reasonable circles with confidence interval type things that say 95% confidence is this one, right? You're on the borderline, this one's another phenotype, but they seem to have chemotype, 732, and different patients of this type might respond in that fashion. We had samples from Washington in this survey along with California, and you could see that the same naming problem was happening in that state too. And it was very difficult to really understand and very frustrating, I think, to see that you can't guide patients that well in that respect. Yeah.
So obviously we can see that there's a problem with the validity and the naming of the product. That's a big issue, which I think is displayed in that graphic there.
Mm-hmm.
My question is if you take a specific strain, like say from a different garden, have you done those types of studies to see what type of variants occur within the same strain given different environmental
We
conditions?
can't get enough cultivators to cooperate to do it very well, but we have been able to see the same clones go in two different directions and produce the same profile, and we have seen them go in two different directions and be wildly different. So sometimes a whole terpene almost drops out and it's very, very low. Sometimes, they didn't change at all. For at least what we were looking for. Whether there were other minor changes, I couldn't tell you, but at least for what we looked at, you could overlay them on top of themselves. Their overall expression was a little different. One guy did a little better than his buddy, which is probably within the analytical variability, but they still claim that someone's a champion. But you could see the ratios were all the same, right? So if I have something that's 10% or something that's 20, if all those ratios are the same when I normalize it, it's still the same thing. I just have to take twice as much of the 10 to get to where I was at with the 20. And I think we'll start to see those types of analytical programs develop to where you can claim that it is that name, or you can claim I'm doing this consistently. Call it what you will. If I can consistently rely on it, whether I want to make sure I didn't fall asleep at the concert or I was really helping to mitigate my back pain, I'm still going to be able to rely on that composition saying that. So I think we'll move in that direction, and that was one of the major reasons I got started in 2010. How do we find what we want from a composition standpoint? No idea it was going to be this hard. Might not have done it if I would have known what I was getting into. I think every entrepreneur kind of says the same thing. What we see with concentrates is a lot less variability because you've taken out most of all the terpenes in those products. So those clustered tightly, and I think this data is not very current for today. We've been upgrading our analytical before we do the whole survey again, and a lot of other new products have entered the market with much more wild terpene variability. So what we noticed though initially, most of the RSO concentrates, original BHO type things like wax, very little terpene profile that was left. When you compare those to flowers, they're not very similar, right? The composition of a concentrate is very different from the flowers. And while those stack on the bottom, when you look at it in 3 dimensions, they don't stack as well. So in summary, what does this profiling survey really tell us, and what are we looking at in that respect, is you can't rely on indica sativa hybrid to tell me what the physiological response is going to be. And that's probably exceptionally frustrating to every doctor and patient out there. But I think it's also immoral to say to an insomniac, this indica is going to really help you sleep when it doesn't have those effects for that individual. I would be much more comfortable with, we don't know today. Try these 3, try these 5 that are different, see what works for you. Come on back and we'll start to narrow down where we can get you to something that works. Because if I promise you it's going to work this way, and you go home and it doesn't, you're not coming back to cannabis. And that person might not be able to benefit from cannabis like they could if we had an honest conversation. Yep.
And in the pharmaceutical market, they can't really do that either. I mean, if someone needs an antidepressant, the first one isn't necessarily the hit.
Exactly. You know, they're all human pincushions in a way, but the doctors run experiments all the time. So
Exactly.
they don't, I mean, some of them are 30% efficacy in their trial. Go try this one. Like, so most of the people are not going to find effects from that. And I think that's not often well understood either. Repeatable consumption is another thing that needs to be standardized. It's probably easier with an oral product. If you take it with or without food, maybe certainly another variable that goes along with that. But your apparatus that a patient might use at home, how they're going to do their own inhalation, it's kind of an individualized, standardized thing. So it's not only, everybody should use, a water pipe at this temperature. Whatever should be comfortable for the individual at home, they should be able to find what's the best thing for them. And there are a large number of options and opportunities in that respect as well. And I think it is possible for the consumers to kind of do that themselves to their own. And we've heard a little bit about what happens with first pass metabolism and when I orally consume, how different might that be, and how might I bypass that or not. Inhaling certainly bypasses that. But when you orally consume, the first thing that you swallow is the THC or CBD molecule, but it's really not present that long. So what you're seeing is the first pass 11-hydroxy-THC at larger amounts having greater activity, which is kind of funny because the Petri dish guy studies THC, then they orally give it to you, and 11-hydroxy is the one that's in the body. So it's, did we even study the right things to make the right conclusions from that? And 11-hydroxy-THC is 5 times more active at the CB1 receptor than THC itself. So they have very different affinities for different receptors. That's one that we studied. We don't know about the others that it may be interacting with. And that, goes along with, sure.
Just have a medicine or a science question. How does the hydroxy combine with the THC? Where is that a digestive process, or where is that transition happening?
The liver. So the liver is the one that's doing that. So that will try and make that first metabolite and then make the second one to excrete. So if it goes through the digestive system, it goes through the liver before it enters the bloodstream. And that's interesting from a DUI perspective too. So if I give you oral products, your nanogram per mil THC is much less than 11-hydroxy. They're not looking for that one, which is causing the wild effects. So you might be below the limit but highly intoxicated. So that's a major fail.
I just wanted to confirm that when we were throwing around that roughly 5-to-1 enhanced potency of orally ingested cannabis, so if we subtract out some amount of potency because we lose some of it in first pass metabolism, but then we almost add back some of the potency because it's 11. So that's kind of like the net sum of that is this 5-to-1.
You almost get the same place.
And that's taken into account in the 5-to-1.
But how do you account for absorptivity?
Yeah, it's more complicated than that because it's not equilibrium.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's. I think we can use simplified models to start to get close, but we can't say it's the exact answer, and it can be very different for every individual because the absorption rates could be wildly different. Marinol is only absorbed at 40% of the formulation, so it's really, if you start to do the math, you're like, well, did I end up in the same place if I inhaled this much? So do I want to have this complicated conversation with the general public because they're not going to follow it anymore?
As I recall, the hydroxy component is actually a very large part of that equation. Am I right about that? So how much variation is there one person to the next as far as how their body's absorbing that?
I don't know if we have a great amount of data. The DUI guys might get that for us. So hopefully we can have a bunch of standardized product. They can go check a whole bunch of blood levels and they can say, wow, these guys all ate the same thing, but I saw wildly different metabolic rates. So I don't know if that's been published. It's probably held by GW. I'm sure they have it.
Well, we have some of that data from Marinol when they were going through their phase studies. They had to give you a standardized dose, check your blood levels at 1 5-hour, 24-hour intervals. So
And this is from a Dutch study. The white line is the carboxy, the light blue line is the 11-hydroxy, and the dark blue is THC. And on the right is the inhaled, and on the left is the oral products. So what's misleading about it is the light blue line looks really low on the left, but you have to remember it's, again, 5 times more active at CD1. And what you see is, the different durations that you get. We all have felt if you orally consume, it takes a while to come on, but it lasts very long. And if you inhale, it doesn't seem to last the same rate. And those are what some of those metabolic profiles look like. Again, I had mentioned different types of inhalation devices will deliver different types of cannabinoids from the same plant material. So even if I've standardized that, ground it all up, made sure every patient got the same thing. If one guy goes home with a handheld glass pipe and the other one's using a 6-foot water pipe, they're going to get different levels of cannabinoids interacting with them. So it's really a kind of a individualized standardization at home. They just have to know that they're getting the same thing every time, and they can tailor themselves. And what our studies with the pre-rolls determined was you get about 40% at most efficiency from a pre-roll cigarette. So, sure, you have a question?
Can you go into a little bit more detail about how, how that difference in ingestion affects, like, are there specific chemicals, or is it just, we can just say it's different in general, and that's about it?
No, well, there are different molecules having different activities, right? I have more of the 11-hydroxy in the body if I take it orally than if I inhale it, first and foremost. So I've got totally different ratios. Yeah, between that, it's hard to say exactly what those are. We haven't studied which ones are there. And you'll get different profiles from combustion versus vaporization, right? So it depends how much I've heated it, at which temperature, and which ways I'm going about it. This guy might inhale stronger, so it's shorter to burn the same amount than the other guy, and it's exposed at different rates that way. That's why that window was kind of 30 to 40%. We had a machine inhaling and trapping this stuff, and we still didn't have them all be exactly the same. So there's just a little bit of variability, but I think there's a therapeutic window for cannabinoids, right? Do I need to have exactly 4.753 milligrams to have this effect, or is 5 okay? 5's probably okay, right? So what's the exact, tolerance to some of that? I think we've got a pretty good window on that. And this is kind of repetitive, and since we're pressed a little bit for time. What is the definition of repeatable, I think, from a doctor and patient or even consumer perspective? It really can vary in a lot of ways, and what the regulator needs to task themselves with is, how do I get to a consistent label, right? And if that is consistent, and I got the same thing in the bottle every time, or the package every time, then the patients at home can do the same thing with it, whatever that might be for them, and they can have conversations with the doctors. So we can start to take this wild variability and shrink it down into a place where we can have good conversations, much higher likelihoods of potential success for people of different types, and saying, go try this first and foremost, or try these 3 things that we know are very, very different. Tell me how you feel on each of those, or 3 or 5, and then say, now how do I narrow you into, this one's good in the morning, this one's good for you at night. I think, we can say the toxicity is fairly low with cannabis. You're not gonna shut off your heart and lungs, so you won't overdose in that fashion. It can be a very horrifying experience if you have too much orally, and that's not what anyone wants either, so start with low amounts and work your way up. And I like to put the med in medicine. What is my minimum effective dose? What is the smallest amount that is going to cause the most amount of benefit? We'll go a little bit onto the legal framework. I think we've heard a little bit about that. And I did read most all of those things, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving legal advice in any way, but it is complicated to be an entrepreneur in these fields. We help consult for operations in Washington, Oregon, and California, and each of those are their own animal. They all have their own way of operating, and in California, we're seeing that we're in a great state of flux. I don't know if we all know when it's actually going to roll out, how it's going to roll out, or how those things are going to change. But it's definitely going to be interesting to watch. And as you've heard, it is more along the lines of a local permitting and business license process before I get a state license. We work with a lab that got permitted in Monrovia. We work with a manufacturing site that got permitted in Coalinga. So there are people, and that's for volatile extraction. So there are some cities that are permitting. It's a lengthy conversation with the city manager, the police chief, the fire marshal, the building planner, but they're all pretty hungry for information. They're all interested in what's going on. We helped the facility in Eugene, Oregon, and the fire marshal there was like, you guys are awesome, I love what you're doing. The city planner was like, I got to go around the state with all the city planners and I look like a genius because you guys have trained me for all this stuff, so thank you for all the help. Can I bring my friends through? Can we show them what we should be learning for others? And they're really interested in working with people that are presenting professionally, presenting in an informed fashion and trying to work with them. So it's no longer, I hate my city and I'm trying not to work with them. It's, I want to find the ones I can work with. I want those who are open-armed and accepting of it. And we want to bring businesses that are sustainable along with jobs. And Coalinga certainly thought that if I can revitalize the city here with local jobs, that would be a wonderful thing. And that operation doesn't have many people, but it's already the 6th largest employer in the city. So they're very happy there, and hopefully that can continue. In California, finally, we will have mandatory testing, maybe by the end of 2018, everyone will do it. They're going to roll it out slowly because they're worried about a lab bottleneck, and the requirements on the laboratories are extreme. So in looking at the draft regulations, the manufacturing ones were really good. We didn't have many comments or changes to that. They really copied food GMP, and that was pretty solid. The testing ones, giant catastrophe. There were probably 35 different comments, almost one in every section, that they didn't do something right. Or they went overzealous and said you have to use this type of marker when you're making your sampling gun. And that is something that you almost can't enforce from a regulatory perspective, so why put it in the regs? Draft comments or suggested guidance documents on how best practices are done should not be in the regulations. They should be set aside and said, do it this way or a better way. But here's the bare minimums of what you need to do, and here's what we would require. And they unfortunately seem to struggle with some of the math in terms of pesticide limits, residual solvent limits, and what other states have kind of been trying to go through as well. But if I orally consume a product, I shouldn't see that my cannabis has much, much more stringent requirements than my apples and grapes. And I'm probably using 10 milligrams of THC when a concentrate at the gram level is 800 or 900 milligrams. So I'm using a tiny fraction of this thing that you're telling me to test, and the limit's already lower. All the math starts to say that there's almost no pesticide in that product right there. So they really didn't quite understand how to assess that problem the right way. But homogeneity is one of the best things I think they had in the testing regs, and will be good for everyone. Sure.
Can I hear you make a comment that they're going to slowly roll out the requirements for testing?
The draft said that it would be 6 months that you would have to be fully testing if you were licensed by the state. So you'd have to say in your package that this was not fully tested, but you didn't have the mandatory requirement that you had to test in that time. Which if you're thinking of being a testing lab and you're putting all the money into that, very frightening. Like you could be sitting there for almost a year with millions of dollars of equipment and expensive people to run it. You're ISO certified and licensed, and no one's forced to test it. So from an entrepreneurial perspective, it's really daunting. And your investors should really know because they're going to start screaming at you the second you get licensed. And if you're not handing back any of their money because you don't have mandatory tests, and I'll assure you no one tests until it's mandatory. They've all told us they won't do it. It's very clear.
That's happening. That's happening in Hawaii right now.
Yeah, I would not doubt that. So yeah, we've seen it here long enough. I've had a lot of dispensaries. You guys are awesome. You know how to test really well. Do the job really well. I won't do it until I'm forced to. I'm like, but your dog's medicine's tested. Oh, good point, but I don't care. So it's frightening, disturbing, and I think most of the consumers believe it is tested when it's sitting on the shelf already, and that's the frightening part.
I was just curious because it sounds like you're involved or whatever. Like, what type of infrastructure is established to effectively accommodate this testing requirements? Like in terms of the statewide, like a lot of these businesses, are they established?
There aren't that many labs today. There was probably 15 or so, and I would say there's a very small fraction of that can actually competently get the job done, if any of them quite yet. The pesticide stuff is so challenging. I don't think many people could have the right equipment nor have the right people to run it really well. And we're spot checking lots of different labs, and we're seeing wildly different results.
And is the FDA going to be responsible for the
No, the FDA does not look at any of this stuff. The FDA does not look at cannabis at all. The Bureau will be the ones looking at it in California. Yeah, the Department of Health will watch the manufacturers, and then they will spot check samples from the shelf. But the Bureau has regulatory oversight over the dispensaries and the testing labs. So they will be the ones that say, are you ISO certified? Are your methods validated? Are you doing that the right way? Leaning on the accrediting bodies. And then hopefully do proficiency testing, which I'm with Hillary. I think Oregon has done it really well. It'll of all the states, they're doing the best possible job, business friendly, really getting it right. They require ORLAB accreditation, they require standardization of the labs in that fashion. The labs go take the sample, and they're doing a really good job in some of those respects and have a good pesticide list. So I hope California will try and look at them. And what I think it all relates to is what's on the label. So what is on the label, what are we going to look at in that respect, and how are we going to make sure that what you're telling consumers are what they're actually getting, right? So no more misrepresentation of a cultivar or a name of a product, no more misrepresenting how much is in there, no more false marketing claims that it's curing cancer. You shouldn't be able to say that anyway because you have no study to back it up, and I think we're going to see things radically change as the regulator comes in that respect. How tightly they control those things, we'll see what the drafts end up as. But this is a very complicated world. And where are we along the whole continuum? What's the right product for the right consumer in the end? How do you find, the global minimum? Is the local one good enough for them? It very well may be. So it's really a wonderful world of diversity and complexity, but it's also the double-edged sword of being the challenge of finding the right thing for the particular patient or consumer needs in that respect. And that'll conclude my talk for today. Thanks for your time.